Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to This Week in the News, a feature of the Daily Evolver and 10,000 Heroes podcast with Ankur Delight. I'm here with Ankur, and good morning to you. And Ankur, take it away. What are we talking about today?
All right. Good morning, Jeff. So I selected this article, based on perusing, it was online, but it was kind of like I was sitting at this desk and had this big newsprint in front of me with some like coffee. That was the attitude. So I saw this article on Nazi symbols worn by Ukrainian soldiers. And I was like, oh, there's going to be some good stuff in there for us. And
Yeah.
it turns out there was. So the background, I mean, there's background to the background, but I guess the gist of the article is that there have been numerous instances on official Ukrainian army or Ukrainian nation social media of soldiers wearing patches and insignia that are symbols related to the Nazis.
Yep.
And when it was when they were asked about it, or in one case, I think the New York Times asked them about it, those images were immediately taken down. But it turns out that it's quite I don't know if common is the right word, but there's a certain faction. I mean, this whole thing is that then it just gets like very fascinating. But there's a faction of the people fighting in Ukraine that are not actually official Ukrainian military. They were like essentially resistance fighters or paramilitary organizations that started out, I think, as like far right political parties, but then organized and resisted the Russian invasion of Crimea and became some of the first resistance fighters in Ukraine in this kind of modern round of warfare. And then it kind of draws back. Some of the iconography they use has to do with when Russia had control of Ukraine in the lead up to World War II and the Nazi German invasion of Ukraine, which people there saw as a liberation.
Yep.
Some of these people then fought alongside the Nazis against the Russians, liberate their homeland. But may have had some ideological similarities as well, like also participated in like violence against the Jews and the Poles and this kind of. So it's this like very complicated story that is now mixed with neo-Nazi. I don't know if like hate groups is really, it's too biased a term. Neo-Nazi advocacy groups and their insignia. And so there's like, they're kind of borrowing imagery. And so that's kind of the basis. And one of the interesting parts is that the people who normally see themselves as the people who will kind of out this kind of stuff, like the Anti-Defamation League and other like anti-Semitic organizations, are not saying much because they're really concerned that by exposing this or kind of criticizing it, they'll be falling into pro-Russian talking points.
Yeah.
Because one of Putin's narratives is that Ukraine is a Nazi state. So, and there's actually a lot here that is confusing to me. So I'd be interested in getting your first take on like, how do we see this from an integral lens? Because there's a lot of it to me. Maybe I'll just give a little hint as to my confusion. There's like this border of what do people mean when they use these symbols, and what do other people think they mean? And maybe there's a quote that I'd like to read. So in the Times article, they quote this historian. I'm going to butcher the name, so apologies in advance. Ihor Kozlovsky, a Ukrainian historian and religious scholar, said that the symbols had meanings that were unique to Ukraine and should be interpreted by how Ukrainians viewed them, not by how they had been used elsewhere. And the quote is, "The symbol can live in any community or any history independently of how it is used in other parts of Earth."
Yeah, this is where the ability to hold multiple perspectives really comes in handy, because, we sort of want to land on one story and we want to create a narrative drive that explains this thing that's happening in front of us that's so horrifying. And there are many narrative drives in this story. And one of the things that Integral brings to the party that I think is so helpful is the idea of cultural evolution and stages of development. And just to do a quick recap, I often point out that the three stages of development that are online right now are traditionalism, modernism, and postmodernism. They're in contention. And they're in contention in every country, certainly the countries that are at play here: Russia, Ukraine, the West, United States. They all have strata at these various stages. And also, and this is where the Nazi thing comes in handy, there's a pre-traditional stage. There's a warrior stage of just conquest that, no country or no human being is at any one stage at any, there's lots of different, there's centers of gravity, as we say, so that you would have, parts in traditional, parts in modern, and so forth. And so, there's a real ethnocentric kind of holy warrior that's in a way that's the sour spot in history, where we have holy, which is traditional, that divides the world into good and evil. Mm-hmm. And then warrior is that stage where your job is to cleanse the evil vermin infidels from the land and return it to God and people. And that was the motivation of the Nazis. I mean, that's just the sort of stupefying, nauseating truth about good and evil warfare, which has been most of recorded history, is one group fighting to conquer another that they see as evil, bad, and impure, and all the stuff that we do when we're ethnocentric or racist, as we now call them. So, there's that strata of people. There's that strata of people here. They don't have a big say. They make a big fuss sometimes. A lot of times they keep their beliefs, to themselves, and they live a normal modern life. In Ukraine, I think that it's unique, as that the quote said. Ukraine had been literally starved into submission by Stalin and the Soviets in early 30s. And then the Nazis come in, and they are absolutely seen as liberators. These people are they're naturally, again, ethnocentric. They're religious. They feel the call of blood and soil. This is a strata of humanity that, in a way, we should all feel. I think in the integral world to come, we will have reintegrated a lot. I was just telling you before, I think we pressed record, that I just came back from England, where my people are from, and both sides of my family. And so I do feel that sort of karmic liquid history when I'm there, and I'm really interested, and I feel really at home. And I have a friend who's Italian, and she has the same sort of feel for Italy. And, it's something that can be noticed and, integrated. I didn't have that when I was a kid. Nobody ever talked about, our wonderful English heritage, but it's, kind of there. So, so in Ukraine, it's there. And, the upside is militarily that these, like the Azov Regiment, that's one of these people, one of these groups. Yeah. They're tremendous fighters. That holy warrior, that stage of development, they're fierce fighters. I guess they're largely responsible for defending Mariupol, and so they'll be legendary. But here's the other thing about development that is really important to take into account here, is that, and this is, again, something that's almost obscene to say, but wars are developmentally, evolutionarily potent. Countries who have been tested in this way sort of have to dig deep and find out who they are. And, old calcified ways of thinking, institutions, they're all, we're at square one, yet we have the wisdom that we learned. Look at, Germany and Japan after World War II, how quickly they not only rebounded, they moved forward into the vanguard of development at this time, actually. So that's going to happen. That's actually going to happen to both Ukraine and Russia. However they end this war, both sides will have learned a lot about themselves and will do deep rethinking. And that's always evolutionarily potent. So maybe I'd stop there and just see if more confused or,
Yeah. That part is clear to me. And, the power of like the mixture of like the red and the traditional, the paladin part, but there's two things that I find, I guess one thing I find concerning and one thing I find confusing. And so the concerning thing to me is that like the groups like the Anti-Defamation League or whoever it is, the groups that are like, hey, these symbols have a lot of power and meaning, and they're not we're not fans of them, that they won't say that because they think people can't handle the nuance of there's Russia, and these are the desires of Russia, and then there's Ukraine, and these are the desires of Ukraine, and then there's us in the West, the mainstream West. It's not one thing. Because like half of the elites in this country are like really concerned about Russia, and then the other half are really concerned about China, and maybe not so concerned about Russia. But there's these people in the U.S. that are really concerned about Russia, and that's what's driving our foreign policy assistance to Ukraine in this. And the fact that mentioning this like history of ties of imagery with the Nazis, and I think more than imagery, from what I could tell. I mean, it wasn't just that like these people were into the imagery, but they were like participating in the violence against the Jews and the Poles and massacres. It's like it's more than that.
Yep.
And to be able to just say all that in one paragraph and have it not, there's no simple conclusion. It's not like, well,
right,
we should stop helping these people, or because really we're not helping them. It's a proxy war where like we're doing this for our own benefit, right? Which is like there's so many other instances in the last 20 years where we could have helped people in a similar situation and we didn't because they weren't useful for us in our proxy war, right?
Yeah.
So it's really like, to me, it's a bad sign that we can't talk about this in a more nuanced way.
Yeah.
Or that just because they have this imagery that we find distasteful, that we can't bring it up and also still support them militarily because it's going to lead to our pragmatic military.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the U.S. and the West, I think in general, sees Ukraine as our people, our soldiers, we're on their side. It's a natural thing. And I would argue that developmentally, it's a natural thing too, in that, we have a country in Russia that is center of gravity, traditional. Actually, it's more comfortable with autocracy. It's less human rights. It's less oriented to Europe than Ukraine. More center of gravity, modern. Even with their right wing and even with their chaotic politics and so forth, they were more European in that way. And that's a stage. Those are two stages. Again, centers of gravities. There's exceptions. It's we're talking probability clouds ultimately here, but it is rare that I'm trying to think of another case where a modern country was attacked by a pre-modern country or an autocracy. And so there is a natural, the other modern countries do feel that. Ukraine may not have been part of NATO, but NATO is that block of countries that's saying that we're going for liberal values here. We're going to trade with each other instead of fight with each other. We're going to recognize borders. We're going to recognize human rights. We're going to have free expression. We're going to have courts. We're going to have separated powers. We're going to have, peaceful transfers of power. That's modern. That's a whole developmental stage of worldview that pre-modern people not only don't get, they don't like it. It's too challenging for me. I was watching some so-called man on the street interviews in Moscow the other day on YouTube. And there was a couple of people who were just like, basically, I miss the Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
Back when we knew who we were and, we didn't have all this fracas and all this gay and, all that, the Western cultural stuff is just anathema.
Make Russia great again, right?
Yeah.
Same movement. Yeah.
And I think there's an argument, you can connect the dots that this is a U.S. proxy war. And I say that I agree with that. You can also connect the dots that this was, a war on a modern country that they themselves, they don't feel like they're tools of America. They feel like, Ukrainians, I'm shocked actually at the lack of dissent. And this may be, in a sense, what you're talking about. The lack of a noticeable peace movement in Ukraine. Is it suppressed? Probably somewhat, yes. Just as it is, there's a self-suppression that is coming from Western journalists where we don't want to report atrocities committed by Ukraine.
Yeah.
That there is probably a factor of many of Russian atrocities compared to Ukraine, but they still happen. That there are anti-Semites, that, Ukrainians are not, as particularly these, more nationalistic right wing, they're not going to be pro-gay anytime soon. There's all kinds of things going on here that the West doesn't want to hear about because it complicates a good versus evil story.
Yeah.
There's a strata in me that I don't want it complicated. It's like, fuck Putin.
Yeah.
I want to see this, I want to see Ukraine, blow them back.
Yeah.
And then there's the modern part of me that says, okay, we got these players here and neither of these guys are going to lose, really. Nobody's going to go scorched earth here, hopefully. So how do we negotiate something that everybody can hurt a little bit and everybody can live with and move forward, keep the system going? That's my modern, Jeff.
Yeah.
And then there's the postmodern that is, outraged. It's funny. The liberals are the more pro-war.
Yeah.
And progressives. Because there's, the little guy's getting beat up by the big guy. And I feel that too. So, as an integralist, I can notice all three of those people, Jeffs, all three of those Jeffs. And at some point, I have to make a decision about, am I going to vote for the ones who want more war or the ones who want, to negotiate now? Or I'm glad I don't have to make that decision ultimately. But, as a citizen, I'm going to have to vote for somebody at some point.
Right. But I think this is a really important, for us and for every person listening, this is like the real spiritual question, or the question that's going to influence our lives, is can we have the space to hold that multiplicity of narratives? Because it's so easy, even as an integralist, to forget about that and just be like, fuck Putin. This is just about that. It's so easy.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. No, that's one of the things that it's real integral practice to take on. Even what's Russia's point of view? What's the average Russian's point of view? And yeah, you could argue that they've been propagandized and whatever, but they also have a real sort of again, I often say that in the integral future sacred world to come, we will all cherish Russianness. Whatever that is, that sort of soul of Russianness that feels, put upon, and they have this horrible history, and yet they have this romantic, they're like Enneagram 4s. I don't know if you know the Enneagram, but they're tragic romantics.
Okay.
And, so, I don't know, that's a stereotype that I think is built on some truth. And in a way, just from another perspective, the last thing Putin could really tolerate was a successful modern country on his borders, that basically had the same lineage. And why did that happen for them? And Putin, have led Russia into, who buys anything Russian? except, oil. So, this sort of miserable country. So anyway, I'm rambling, but again, you can, as an integralist, let all of these stories in. And that's why I love to listen to these man in the street interviews where Russians are actually talking, and Ukrainians too. And it's just every one of them, it breaks your heart,
Yeah.
because they all believe it. That's one of the things that, as an integralist, it's like I tend to believe the last person I talk to.
Yeah.
And as I should, not to take it on totally, but to add it to the pieces of the truth that make up a more complex and integrated worldview, which is what we want.
Which is what we want.
Yeah. So to figure that out, we get that all straightened out.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's good for now. I'm sure.
I think it's good for now too,
Yeah.
man. Yeah. Wow, Ankur, well, what fun. Thank
Yeah.
you for showing up and, posing these great questions and,
Well,
give
I
us a chance
to be
work
really
it out.
honest with you, Jeff, I missed you,
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
and
that's
I'm glad we're back on track here.
I think we are too. Yeah. Happy to be. All right, Ankur. Well, then I think we're all settled up, and stay in touch and see you next week.
See you next week, Jeff.
All right. Thanks, folks, for listening. This is Jeff Salzman signing off. See you at the next Daily Evolver.